Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Douglas Crawford, a longtime friend and mentor who has been helping entrepreneurial scientists create successful startups in the life sciences space. Doug and his team have systematically lowered the barriers between great ideas and successful companies. Doug is a scientist by training who received his Ph.D. in biochemistry from UCSF. Doug created and manages MBC Biolabs, a state-of-the-art co-working laboratories in San Francisco and San Carlos that allow entrepreneurs to rapidly generate data without getting bogged down in facility management. In the first 6 years, this program has launched 210 companies that have brought 53 programs to the clinic, a super impressive feat that can generate cures for many conditions. Doug is also an investor, the managing partner of Mission BioCapital, and the managing director for Mission BioCapital. These funds operate out of San Francisco and Boston. Doug has overseen investments in 52 companies, 11 of which have already enjoyed successful liquidity events. There is so much to explore from talking to Doug, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. All right, Doug, welcome to the show. I was going through my email to check when was the first time I learned about you, and it was in 2010 when I just came to UC Berkeley as a postdoc and came to one of your QB3 workshops. And I think it was one of the most consequential, you call it fateful encounters.
Wow.
that influenced me to take the startup route and also around building a startup ecosystem for postdocs and grad students at UC Berkeley. This podcast is a result of that. In my opinion, you're like a godfather to biotech startups.
Oh my goodness.
In a good way. And thank you for all you've done and the ways you continue to support the startups in the Bay Area.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's overly kind of you. But we have traveled together for many years in this very similar space of trying to help entrepreneurial scientists achieve their dreams. So it's great. I hate to tell you how many years it's been, right? So you said 2011 was when we first met?
2010.
10, my gosh. Are we getting old?
We came a long way. I will touch upon some of the things in my talk to give a sense of the scale of where it started before and where it is right now. But let's start with the basics. What got you started in the space of biotech startups? How did you start? Where did it start?
There is an origin story here, I think, that's interesting. And I was a graduate student at UCSF, and Reg Kelly contacted me just as I was finishing up. He actually called me from a bar in Mexico and said, this terrible connection. Doug, you want to join me at this new institute, QB3? And so I said, sure. So the day after I graduated with my Ph.D., I started working with Reg. And our goal was to help QB3 become both an agent of promoting cross-campus research, but importantly also foreseeing that the research done on the university campuses gets out to the world. So we began with an obvious but fundamental belief that without a company, you can't benefit patients. Nothing that's discovered in a university can in and of itself help a patient without a company in between. It could be a big company, it could be a pharmaceutical company, but that's pretty rare. Mostly it's going to be startups. They're the most efficient engine in the world to turning an idea into something practical for society. So we took a look around, and this is the mid-2000s, and UCSF, for instance, was getting about $750 million in federally funded research then. and only producing maybe 2 to 4 companies a year. So if you think about that as a funnel with $750 million coming in at the top of the funnel and 2 to 4 companies coming out at the bottom, that's a terrible conversion. And it also was wildly frustrating for the scientists who were making those great discoveries that their papers in Cell Nature Science, which had such potential, were languishing and not having the impact that they could. So we asked the question then, and should have asked the question much earlier. We, society, should have asked the question much earlier. What's the impediment? The thesis we started with is that maybe it's that 0 to 1 step. And so we conceived of and created the first technical incubator in the UC system. That was the QB3 Garage. And the experiment we ran was to say, if you gave a scientist the minimum amount of space, the minimum viable space, not the minimum viable product, but the minimum viable space.
MVS.
Yes. Could they produce something that would be catalytic to their idea or project? And we did what we were supposed to do, which is we went around and we asked a lot of venture capitalists, is this a good idea? Should we open an incubator? And 100% of them said, no, that's a terrible idea. You'll just create an intensive care unit for little companies. One of them very depressingly said, you don't want to own the chairs in a game of musical chairs where you're taking players away. The idea being that the biotech industry in the mid-2000s was not in a healthy state, and it was basically going to go out of business. And you didn't want to be in the real estate side of an industry that was going away. So we did what lots of good entrepreneurs do. We sought counsel from smart people, and then we totally ignored it. So we went ahead and built the incubator anyway, and we said, this is going to be an experiment. Is it that there are great companies languishing behind, or are we just going to create an intensive care unit for little companies? And so, as you know, we chose 6 companies that moved in, and within 2 years, 4 of those companies had closed substantial venture financing rounds, and a 5th was acquired by Affymetrix right out of the space. Let me tell you that the characterization of those companies, none of them were venture backable. None of them were, they were mostly scruffy graduate students and postdocs with a credit card and a dream, maybe an SBIR grant, really thinly capitalized. And yet within 2 years, they had made such great progress that they could get substantial venture financing or an exit. And so that really validated to us that the 2 primary points of our thesis. Are there great ideas that are languishing? Yes. Is it a small laboratory, the minimum viable lab space, is that sufficient to get them the data necessary to attract capital? And the answer to that very happily was yes, too. So that set us down a course, then led to a venture firm, Mission BioCapital, now Mission BioCapital, and now a plethora of labs. We have 3 labs, 1 in San Francisco and 2 down in San Carlos, and we will be opening a 4th lab in San Francisco in later 2022, and a 5th lab down in San Carlos in 2024. So it's been just a hugely satisfying journey to date. I'll pause there.
That is a fascinating story, starting from a call from a bar from Reshkali in Mexico, going to this idea and being called, it's going to be an ICU by the venture capitalist. This is mid-2000. We'll get to the scale of investments going into bio now, experiment running. And I remember you pitching at every workshop, if you have a credit card, all you need to do is you need that, we'll give you that minimum viable space. We've come a long way, and success is about to be talked about. I was at this award ceremony where you and Reshkali got the Distinguished Life Sciences Leaders Award in 2015, the Pantheon Awards. It was so well deserving.
Oh, no, thank you.
I was so happy to see you guys. For those who don't know about Doug and Reshkali, I think we should do a documentary on this one. For the sake of this podcast, let's stick to this. What is MBC Biolabs all about? And in 2011, you mentioned that you're going to open a 13,000 square feet of incubator. That was the email that I received. If I'm looking for space, looks so tiny now. What is it like today? Give us a history and tell us where we are.
The first site, the one inside the university, which we called the QB3 Garage, was opened in 2007, and that was 2,300 square feet. It was tiny, and yet we crammed 6 companies in there. And our big problem in the years that followed was not attracting companies or seeing those companies through to success, but rather the problem was there was a line of entrepreneurs outside the door and we didn't have enough space. So it was clear we had to get more space. We were working from within the university then, and so our natural thought was publicly funded laboratories. And we tried really hard to get that done. And there just was not the will at the state level or within the UC system to do that. And so we then had to turn to the private sector. Again, an iconoclastic idea, because no one, to my knowledge, had ever run a life science incubator as a for-profit business. And I air quoted that. Hard to do on a podcast, but it's not a wildly profitable business still. But we said, is it possible to run this where you can make enough money in rents from tenants to cover the costs of operating the incubator? And as I say, to my knowledge, that had never been done before. All the other incubators that I was aware of had been subsidized by municipalities or universities. And I've now helped raise 5 venture capital funds. That's a walk in the park compared to trying to raise money for the first commercial life science incubator. There was a lot of skepticism around that. But we did that. We raised enough money. We started the lab that's now MBC Biolabs in San Francisco, and it's a 24,000 square foot site. And the development partner who we worked with then, I think, was pretty convinced we would be out of business in a year, but was convinced that they could rent that whole building to a single company when we went away. And we are now joined at the hip with that developer. That's Dewey Land Company. Every project we do with them, and they're an intimate partner of ours. But that really created a novel model. The advantage of having been commercial from the start is that now we can scale. And so we're at 78,000 square feet today. We'll be at over 200,000 square feet of lab space by 2024. We're 108 companies in our space today, and we'll be 250 or 300 companies by 2024. Okay, so that's sort of the macro picture of the space. The fundamental question is, why is the space so important? What is it about space? Labs are labs. Why is that relevant? And that's because of the nature of our industry. Think about the tech space. Think about creating Zappos. What do you need to do that? Well, the ability to put an online store up, a website and an online store, is well-trodden territory. The big risk when creating Zappos was, do people really want to buy shoes online? Don't you want to touch them, try them on, look at them in the mirror? How can you possibly do that online? And Zappos proved to the world that no, people are perfectly willing to buy shoes online. But it was a market risk. It was not a technical risk. By contrast, the companies that we work with, it's obvious that there's a market for a cure to Duchenne muscular dystrophy or leukemia, whatever the case may be. There's no market risk question, but there's a huge technical risk question. And so what our labs allow people to do is to generate data at the minimum amount of time and capital, and do that in an environment where they're working shoulder to shoulder with dozens of other companies. Great externalities of communal support and intelligence emerges from putting 40 companies into the same building together. That data then drives the attraction of capital and ultimately the success of those companies. And can I do a little bragging?
Yes, please. You have all the bragging rights.
So our first site, which we opened in 2013, is where most of the statistics I'm going to give you come from, because the other sites have opened more recently. But if you think about that 124,000 square foot site, which opened in 2013, The companies we've helped have raised over $10 billion. They've brought 54 programs to the clinic. There are phase 3 clinical trials underway right now from drugs that were developed on our campus. They've brought 13 approved diagnostics and 71 products to market. And you might go, hold it, Doug, a biotech incubator, what do you mean products? Well, one of the segments that we've been proud to help have been research tools, and we've also helped food companies. Ripple Foods and Wild Type have gotten their start with us. Alpine Roads now, Nobel Foods. So if you went through all of those cosmetics companies, there are 71 actual products out there in the world too from companies that got their start with us. So it's just huge productivity. One 24,000 square foot building basically brought 50 drugs to the clinic. If we could write that large across the entire industry, what an amazing jump in productivity we'd enjoy.
I don't think there is anything more productive than this. You started with 4 companies in QB3 Garage, 54 products in the clinic now, 13 diagnostics, 71 products. That is like fascinating by every accord. Congratulations on that. And thank you for doing that. Let's stick to that subject of like, how does one get into MBC Labs? And what are the resources you provide if they get in?
It's harder than I want it to be. And it's not because we're obnoxious and say no because we like to say no. It's sadly that there are more entrepreneurs than we can serve, that we would like to serve. We're getting maybe 6, 10 more applications a month. Those entrepreneurs come to us and they give a presentation. They spend half an hour describing the science, introducing the team. We then select the companies we think are the best fit for us from that pool based on how much space we have available. We're usually welcoming about 1 or 2 new companies a month, 6 to 10 applicants, 1 to 2 are invited for whom we have sufficient space. And so what do we look for? So we have a simple algorithm. First, we look for people who are experts in their subject matter and also fun to be around. Remember, this isn't a sandbox with 40 companies in it in each site. So you got to be...
People matter.
People matter, right? And you got to be fun. 2, we're looking for people who are working on big problems. So we want people who want to swing for the fence, attack a really big problem. And then the third thing is we look at their presentation, their deck, and that's really not us sitting around going, I don't know, that target, I'm not sure that makes sense to me. It's much more us saying, does the deck reflect the fact that they're expert and working on a big problem? Are they passionate about that? And so from there, we get to welcome in about 2 companies a month. And they're with us for periods up to 2 years or more. We try to move the little chicks out of the incubator within 2 years. Some of them take a little bit longer, but we put increasing pressure on them to move on at about a 2-year period.
Thank you for explaining that. You mentioned this earlier. Market is not big of a risk in this space. Technical feasibility is a big risk, and people should be fun to be around, to hang out in the labs around there, and they should be working on big problems. And this thing comes up again and again, the concept of space. And I was in an innovation council meeting at UC Berkeley recently, and a private developer told about how there's no space for biotech startups to come. And these all shared spaces at MBC Labs. Like, give us a sense of like how much does each company take up, and how big do they grow in these companies? Throw us some numbers, like how big is the largest team?
I would guess maybe 17 or 18. We had one company manage to get to 22 employees with us. I don't know where they were putting them. They must have been working shift work. The normal profile is a company comes to us with 2 scientists and a dog. And then within the first year, they grow to 5 or 6 is kind of the archetypal. And before they leave us, they usually have 10 or 12 or 14 people in the team. That's the kind of normal trajectory. Sometimes we have entrepreneurs who come to us all by themselves. We have a few of those right now. And then we occasionally get companies that begin kind of with a bang with 5 or 6 people all huddled together, ready to get going. And you asked before, and I didn't answer, what do they get? What are the facilities offering? There's a couple of things companies need. First of all, they need a place to do BSL-2 work. They need a real laboratory environment. So if you went to Starbucks with a computer to start Zappos, you'd be okay. But if you go there with test tubes and living organisms, they might be a little less friendly. So we provide a laboratory environment to do BSL-2 work. But we also appreciate the fact that biology requires sophisticated tools to get your work done. And so every campus has a fully equipped core facility that includes plate readers, flow cytometry, microscopy, PCR, qPCR. Just think about a floor centrifuge for a moment. Something as prosaic as a floor centrifuge. They're $30,000, $45,000. Most companies might run it once a month. So they do a maxi prep and they get to run the floor centrifuge once a month. And so what a terrible utilization of their financial resources to buy one. You put 40 companies together, it spins once or twice every day. So now it's a much more efficient system for them and efficient for us too, since the equipment is being utilized at a pretty high rate. We're so much about speed and lowering costs that we really want them to do experiments within the first week, ideally within the first day. And so if they move in and do an experiment in their first day, I'll give them a bottle of champagne and we take a cheesy picture in front of their bench. We had a company recently that moved from St. Louis to join us in our San Carlos campus. And the scientist arrived at the airport, brought his bag down to the parking lot and took a selfie with him and his bag from the airport and the logo for MBC Biolabs behind him. And then like 4 hours later, he thawed out his first cells and created his first experiment, if you will. And so it's like, wow. And of course, they won a bottle of champagne from me. But that is so huge to be able to walk into a fully functioning lab. Because in the past, Naresh, if you and I had to sit in 2005, we said, okay, let's create a biotech company. What would we have done? Well, we would have put a PowerPoint deck together, how we were going to change the world. We would have driven up and down Sand Hill Road. 99% of the time, Naresh and Doug would have gone home empty-handed, and there would be nothing. We'd go back to our postdocs at Berkeley and UCSF.
Or get another postdoc or a second postdoc or a third postdoc.
Exactly. And that would be it. The 1% that were lucky enough to win over the hearts and minds, actually, I don't sure venture capitalists have hearts, but to win over the minds of the venture capitalists to get them to write a check, they then would have had to turn around and say, oh my goodness, I need a real estate broker. I need to go find some space. I need to make tenant improvements. I got to buy equipment. I got to get permits. I have to hire people. Then they move into the space and they finally do their first experiment. That whole process is 6 to 12 months, during which time they're doing nothing to advance the science. The science is exactly the same way it was 6 to 10, 12 months earlier. They're operating completely outside of their skill set. I didn't study real estate in graduate school. I don't think you did either, right?
Nope.
And so all of those decisions and things they have to do, just a huge time sink. Fast forward to today, MBC Biolabs and J Labs and a few others in the Bay Area give you the opportunity to walk into a beautiful laboratories, not sub-basement closets, but beautiful laboratories and fully equipped, great community, coffee in the common room, and start doing experiments right away. That's a profound change in both what and who can be a biotech company. Because in the past, that 1% that won over the hearts and minds of the venture capitalists, they don't represent the 1% best ideas necessarily. I mean, the really cool stuff is just too hard to appreciate without data, too far out there. And so we say, why don't we let entrepreneurs decide who is going to be a biotech company? Why don't we let them decide by giving them an opportunity to build the data with, as you say, nothing more than a credit card. And so these labs have both accelerated biotech development, but they've also democratized biotech development. So now people who don't look like the traditional model for venture capital backed companies, forgive me, they're not just middle-aged white guys anymore. It's your credit card. you can start the company. And so a great story, an example of this, some early companies, Rachel Horowitz and Jennifer Doudna created Caribou, and they moved into the QB3 East Bay Innovation Center on 7th Street. And Rachel had moved directly from her graduate work at Berkeley to being the CEO of the company. And I think most people would have said, boy, she doesn't look the profile of a CEO of a company. And here we are, I don't know, 7 years later. The company is public. It's doing great. And who's the CEO? Rachel Horowitz. Yep. And so she did that by proving herself at every step of the way that she had the right stuff. And the incubator gave her the chance to prove herself. At the other end of the spectrum, the very first company we had in 953 was Elector. They were the first, they moved in when there were still painters painting the walls. And Arnon Rosenthal was not your archetypal spring chicken. He was, I don't want to pick on Arnon, but he was a gentleman who'd been around a long time. We love that. You get to define yourself wherever you are in your career as saying, I'm ready to go do a startup. I've got a credit card. Let's do it.
Well, speaking of entrepreneurs, what have you seen that these entrepreneurs most need from you? What repeats itself? And what are the most common ways you help them?
That's a really interesting question. When we created our first incubator, we thought that they needed a lot of sage advice from veterans, from some of those gray hairs down on Sand Hill Road. And so we used to schedule office hours where venture capitalists would come and they'd grab a cup of coffee and sit and answer questions and take office hours. And one of the things that we found that was really kind of surprising is we had to work like hell to get the entrepreneurs to want to go to those. Is the guy giving out money? No, he's just here to give out advice. Oh, I'm busy. And so we were surprised at that. Entrepreneurs tend to be a pretty independent set, pretty headstrong. They seek advice around critical technical issues. They don't really love strategic advice. They're really seeking data, and they really want help in choosing paths to get that data, though, or they may need future regulatory guidance, that sort of thing. But strategic advice wasn't very popular. So one of our first tenants, as you probably know, was Dan Widmer at what's now Bolt Threads.
Bolt Threads.
Yeah, refactored materials in those days. And he came and he gave a talk, and he used this phrase during his talk, and he said, it's been great working in the incubator. They've really enabled awesome. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, can I use that? That's a great line. He said, sure. And so everything today, if you could see the back of my jacket, it says enabling awesome on it. And that's exactly what we try to do. We don't tell them what to do. We're not directive. We're not intrusive. We're available. We have been doing this a long time. We are a venture capital firm as well. We have a lot of networks. We open that up to people, but we don't intrude. We don't force it upon them. We really want to be the catalyst for change. And I think the other thing they need is time. So one of the surprising things is how few of the companies in our community go out of business. So if this were a restaurant incubator, you would expect 50% of our companies to go bust in the first 2 years. We see maybe one company out of the 108, we'll see maybe one company go bust every other year.
Wow.
I think, what is that about? Partially because of the constraints imposed by the absence of space and therefore our ability to choose the most promising companies, but also partially because the cost is so low that they can learn their way to success. Pivot has the wrong connotation. I think pivot usually means, oh, I hit a brick wall, I got to find another way. I think a better interpretation of pivot is I'm putting down lots of seeds, and I say, oh my goodness, that plant is growing. Let me put more water and fertilizer on that plant. And so our environment allows them to be so capital efficient, they can plant lots of seeds and ultimately find one that produces beautiful flowers.
We need to find a word for that. Pivot mostly comes with a negative connotation, so they try to make it grand, but let's work on a word for that. And thank you for that insight on that. One other thing I found on your website is about golden tickets. Can you talk about golden tickets and the partnerships that you have with MBC?
I am delinquent in mentioning this, that one of the things that's emerged over particularly the last 5 or 6 years, actually all the way back to our first commercial site, is we have an opportunity by aggregating such great companies together. We become very attractive as a partner to pharmaceutical companies that are looking for innovation. And so we have now an important piece of what we do is we bridge the wide divide between the smallest companies and the largest companies. So we have perhaps 6 or 7 pharmaceutical companies who are partners in our labs who are very keen to meet nascent companies. And so we built a program to facilitate that called the Golden Tickets, and evoking Willy Wonka. Did you read The Chocolate Factory when you were a kid?
Yeah.
Good. So the Golden Tickets simply is a free lab bench for a year. And then the pharmaceutical company that gives it out doesn't require any strings attached. It's a grant, but it does give them the chance to establish a warm and fuzzy relationship with a startup. And the startups, despite what I said about strategic advice, they love learning what the customers want to buy. In other words, what do the dogs want to eat? What kind of dog foods do they want to eat? And ideally, if this works well, it will really help inform data that the companies are generating. So it would be terrible to go to JPM and say, take those 15-minute meetings in the little rooms and show your mouse data and then have them go, God, that's the wrong model. I don't believe that because it's the wrong model. You want to be told in advance, geez, that's really interesting, but what I would need to see is X. And then you can craft your data acquisition to fit the data requirements. And so that's an important feature of our program. And we've seen that, again, I'll go back to Elector. Elector did a $205 million option deal with AbbVie while still a resident in our space. So those nascent partnerships can turn into wonderful things in the fullness of time. But even if they just produce a way to slow the kinetic energy down and have a good conversation about progress that the company would like to achieve and that the pharma would like to see, that can be very useful for everyone.
Absolutely. A few of my guests, Adam Abate and Dave Schaefer, they all form these companies and collaboration with bigger companies. What do the dogs want to eat? Are we making the dog food? The right food is important. I think this is a program that really helps you connect to those big companies. It's hard as individual entrepreneurs to reach out to those. Speaking of pharma, I heard you say in one of your talks, I think it was some Japanese incubator that you're talking to, that if you were a pharma company with the pipeline that you're creating, I think you'd be one of the largest pharma companies in the world.
That's right. 54.
What is stopping you from becoming a pharma company?
Well, that's an interesting question. There have been examples of folks who have gone down that path. Think of Bridge Pharmaceuticals, which basically started as a seed investment vehicle and now has really morphed into a pharmaceutical company. We truly like to enable awesome. We're truly driven by this motivation of the frustration between an idea and the benefits to society. That's what got us started in 2006-07. It still is what motivates me today. And one of the beautiful things about the environment we've created is that we postpone hard decisions like, is this going to work, till much later in the process. And I think that's what makes us so successful, is that we are permissive. We're encouraging. We like boldness. The joke I always say is, if 2 experts in gravity from Berkeley came to see me and said, oh, we have an idea for an anti-gravity machine. We want to build an anti-gravity machine. I'd say, wow, they're world's experts on their subject matter. Is gravity a big problem? Yeah, gravity is a big problem. Do I think it's going to work? No way. But if we ignore the third criteria and just focus on the first 2, we are much more likely to produce outcomes that are really breathtaking. And so I think one of the great virtues of us is that we're more permissive than anyone else. We're more permissive than a venture capitalist would be. We're more permissive than the executive committee at the pharmaceutical company could ever be. Every one of the companies we serve, if they were employees at Genentech and they said, hey, executive committee, I want to spend 4 or 5 people, spend a couple of years working on this, 99% of them would be told by that executive committee, nope, too early, too wrong, never work, go away, you bother me. The famous story about Epogen, the scientist who developed Epogen was told twice by Amgen to stop working on that. Bill Bowes, who passed away a few years ago, who was an original investor, admitted that to me once. Amgen was convinced they knew where the company should go, and there was a wild-eyed scientist who, through passion, continued to pursue Epogen, and today it's, well, for what now, 30 years, it's been a blockbuster product, so pretty amazing.
I didn't know about that story, but didn't mean to put you on a spotlight, but continue enabling awesomeness and the permissiveness, that is important, because the world is filled with experts, which is outdated. They were an expert at something else, and these new people, new ideas come, and just give them a chance in whatever you can. Let's slightly shift gears into Mission BioCapital. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the investment principles, the fund size.
We started Mission BioCapital originally as a UC-based fund. I was an employee of the university. Actually, the way it started was a great friend of ours, a guy named Jack Wadsworth, who ran Morgan Stanley Asia for 15 years and then retired. Great supporter of QB3. Admired what we were doing in the incubator, and he said, forgive me for this, but he said, shit, man, had you been investing in those companies, you'd be doing just fine. And you need a fund. I said, what's that? And he gave me the beer napkin rendition of what a venture fund is. And so he said, well, okay. So in the winter of 2008-9, the Great Recession, we set out to raise a fund. We set out to raise $10 million. And I have to say, I'm very proud of the fact that in August of 2009, we raised $11.3 million. And so I was managing director of the fund, never done any investing in the past. If you looked at my checking account, you wouldn't have trusted me, I don't think, with venture dollars. And we started investing. And that fund is a Forex fund. It's done fabulously well. And then in 2015, we spun that out of the university, and I created Mission BioCapital 2, and then in 2018, Mission BioCapital 3. And then we created a national fund called Bioinnovation Capital. This is going to get complicated with the names. And they were all co-investing. And then we finally recently merged them together into a single unified name, which is Mission BioCapital. Conveniently, it continues to have MBC as its acronym so that all the signs on our buildings still make sense. And Mission BioCapital just completed raising its 5th fund, which is a $275 million fund. We invest primarily in therapeutics companies. We have an appetite outside of that as well. We've done some diagnostics, some medical device, some food. There's a long tail, but probably 70% of our portfolio is going to be in therapeutics. We primarily are in Boston and San Francisco, and the Boston operation is also tied to laboratories, in that case, Lab Central and Biolabs, and in our case, MBC Biolabs. We have this really awesome secret weapon, which is that companies move into our labs because we help them be better, faster, cheaper. And then we live with those companies for 6 to 12 months, and we fall in love with some of them, and then we invest. I look at the way traditional venture capitalists operate, and I have nothing but a mixture of sympathy and respect for what they do, because how can you make an investment in someone you've met half a dozen times in a conference room?
In a deck.
We see our entrepreneurs on the good days. We see them on the bad days. They stop us in the hall with their cell phones and show us data. We get to see not the snapshot, but the movie. And after we invest, we continue to live with them. It's a very intimate relationship. It's been great. So that's us as investors.
What stage of the startups do you usually invest in? And what are the insights you're looking for when you invest in these, other than getting to know these founders well?
It actually follows the same selection criteria that the lab does. It's just a much tighter filter in that we are still looking for passionate world's experts in their subject matter working on big problems. And then on the data side, we're looking for the focus, the progress, and some sort of validation that we're on the right path. We are seed Series A investors. Seed was a word that's really changed in the last 10, 15 years. When I was first starting as an investor, it was a rarely used word. It meant $100,000 check.
$100,000, yeah.
And now you see $15 million seed rounds, but we're seed Series A. We do occasionally build companies from scratch and put them into the labs, but mostly we're investing in companies we meet at the labs. It's a pretty rare company in our labs that we invest in, maybe 5%. And what do we look for? We like to be a little bit where other people aren't. We like to be salmon, if possible. We like real novelty, really. And I also really like impact. If everything works out, you want to really be able to make a difference. I'm not quite sure how to define that, but it really is important that you can be super proud of the company you're building at the end of the day, because it's going to be super hard to build any company you build. So you want to make sure that that time and effort is well spent.
Startups are inherently risky. And how do you evaluate various risks at a startup in the ones you're funding? And how do you look at these, and how do you think about helping these entrepreneurs? I know you are pretty hands-off, but if you had to give advice on a certain risk, how would you proceed with that?
This is a really interesting question. I mean, the challenge is, what are the key milestones for the technology? This is a critical issue to us when we're investing. It's really a sad state of affairs when the critical milestone is a phase 2 or phase 3 study. If you have to put $100 million before you can turn over a risk card, it's just super hard to justify that. And this is a sad state of affairs in the world today in therapeutics development, is that the diseases that are affecting most people, diabetes, heart disease, these are getting very little attention because it is so expensive to turn over those cards. And this is why the orphan diseases have been so attractive, since the preclinical cards are often highly predictive of the early clinical cards. And furthermore, phase 1 study, phase 1B study is got a very high probability of telling you whether you're going to succeed ultimately or not. That's just not the case for a cardiac drug. So what we do is we look for technologies where there is some sort of early inflection point that we can prove. That means that you have to think really hard about that inflection point. It means you may have to be creative about solving that inflection point problem. Can you go to Australia? Can you find another orphan indication that would be the prelude to a larger market indication later that you could get good information about early? But that problem, how do we find the right fit of capital and technology, is a really interesting one. And we work closely with our entrepreneurs to be able to find that right fit. The industry's changed too. So when we started this in 2006, when we first started our first lab, there was a dearth of capital. There were tons of great entrepreneurs with wonderful ideas that were not getting help. Today, 15 years later, happily for the world, that's not the case. So now companies are getting created. I wouldn't say that there aren't still great entrepreneurs who go wanting, but many, many fewer today than there used to be. And in some markets, it's become competitive to get capital. It's almost like those tech investors and tech companies in the late 90s. But that plays well to us because we like to do unusual and adventurous things. And I think those will always be hard to find investors for. So I think that all works out really well for us.
Having said that, you're still a venture capital firm. Returns matter a lot.
Well, I do.
How much do you want to or need to understand a potential business model or revenue model of a business in the early stages? It strikes to me that so many companies have figured out that are much later, especially the biotech. How do you think about these issues? How do you evaluate?
Revenue is not normally something we think much about, because most of the biotech indications that we're pursuing have very large, obvious markets available to them. Having said that, there are a staggering number of companies that get successful approved drug, or get an approval to get an NDA, and then they go to market and there's a disappointing adoption. I was just talking about a drug today, Prialt, which is a peptide for pain that Elan got a successful NDA for. It's an intrathecal pump, complicated, surgically implanted pump, but it cures pain in a class of patients that are otherwise debilitated. And that product, I'm going to say it's $100 million in sales a year, which is, by biotech standards, a very disappointing outcome. And that happens more often than we would like it to, that you get all the way to the end zone, and rather than getting 6 points, you only get 2. But we don't think very much about that because 99.9% of the things we're investing in have obvious gigantic markets. For us, the question is, how do we get inflection points in value? Where's the subsequent capital going to come? And where are those clinical cards going to be turned? And that is not obvious. So 10 years ago, if you had said, I'm going to start investing in neurodegeneration, most people would have said, forget it. Those clinical trials are, an Alzheimer's clinical trial is years and wildly expensive with fuzzy endpoints. So you got to do gigantic patient populations. And then what happened in the mid-teens was that the capacitance gap, if you will, the demand for neurodegeneration drugs became so strong that companies were being acquired preclinically in this incredibly expensive space. And so now that turned on its head the venture-backable nature of neurodegeneration. When did that inflection point occur in neurodegeneration, and how can you be ready for those inflection point changes, is where the art of venture capital becomes most interesting.
Speaking of interesting, if you had to pick one or two startups that you're fascinated by in this past 15 years journey at MBC and QB3, tell us some stories about what fascinated and what worked in their favor to succeed.
I love all my children, so hard to pick just a couple. I'd say some of the stories I really enjoy would be Caribou, which is a kind of obvious one. But here's a company that I first met Jennifer Doudna and Rachel Horowitz in their office. They called me in and asked me, hey, we found this new way of editing genes. What do you think? And you expect me to say, oh, I can see a multi-billion-dollar industry building around this, and I can see a Nobel Prize coming. No, my first question was, hold it, didn't we do that in the 70s? What do you mean you had new gene engineering technologies? We've been doing this for a long time. And then there's talons and there's other things. They went, no, Doug, it's different. I went, oh, okay. I finally got it. But to see what they've been able to do, both in platform development, I don't know if you know, but Rachel Horowitz on the Caribou side has been working very successfully and very hard at increasing the specificity of the editing process with this Chardonnay approach. And they have the opportunity now, it's in the clinic, to produce allogeneic cells, which is the holy grail for cell therapy. If we can do off-the-shelf therapy, we could make this a much more affordable and generally available practice. Super proud of Rachel and what she's done. Super proud of Elector. So Elector, which is the other company I mentioned earlier, their basic thesis is that neurodegeneration is a failure of the immune system. We constantly are developing aberrant proteins and cells in our brains, and an effective immune system is recognizing and expunging, treating those problems. And so patients who suffer from neurodegeneration are suffering from a failure in their immune response. What a great idea. Wow. Now it's not so radical to think about, but pretty out there. So they have pursued that and now have 2 products in late-stage clinical development, 2 compounds and 4 indications. And super proud of Arnon. And the last one, there's so many, but Maggie Ricciardi came to us. She's not a background in biotech at all, not a biologist. She was a project manager, a very effective businesswoman, but she was a vegan. And she said, I want the world to stop eating meat. Let me start with cheese. So she wants to genetically modify soy so that it has the bioelasticity of real cheese when you melt it. In current generations of soy cheese, when you put it in a broiler, it just turns into water. And she wanted a cheese that would be in every way a drop-in replacement for mozzarella or cheddar, for that matter, for a grilled cheese sandwich, pizza, grilled cheese sandwich. And her target market is not Whole Foods and other vegans. Her target market is Pizza Hut. And she wants to have a real impact on the amount of dairy that ends up being served to Americans. So she moved in, no resources, just 2 women, 1 bench, banging away at it. And what do you know, but she could produce more and more elasticity in the cheese, raised a seed round, even better, moved out from our facilities, has now raised a very large B round. They've finalized their products. The soybeans are growing in Hawaii as we speak to build the seed stock of their materials, and she's off to the races, and I'm just super proud of what Maggie's done. So it isn't just drugs, it can be food, and it's non-obvious people, it's non-obvious technologies, it's the stuff that is really going to make a difference to the world.
I'm going to reach out to you for introductions to Rachel, Arden, and Maggie. These are stories that need to be told because we miss those stories. You hear about a success story, $1 billion acquisition here, there, but the story needs to be told because there's so many grad students and postdocs that need to hear and take that path. Thank you for sharing those stories. As an investor, what are the topics that are exciting to you? What are the areas that you're really looking forward to invest in?
Science-wise, it's pretty interesting. The decade of the teens was a decade where we realized that medicine 40 years from now will primarily be a question of going to the doctor and having them turn the rheostat of your immune system up or down. Oh, autoimmune disease. Let me turn that down, or in some sort of tissue-specific way. Oh, you've got cancer. Let me turn that immune system up. And that has really been a remarkable finding all the way from cancer and, as I just mentioned, into neurodegeneration. I think we're still in the infancy of our ability to manipulate that. We spent a lot of time focusing on genetic variation without thinking very much about translational effects, translational regulation, or post-translational modifications other than phosphorylation. A great company. I know I'm bragging about more and more, but there's a wonderful story I should tell you about nitrome. So can I tell one more story?
Yes. We love stories.
This company was founded by a woman who had been at Elan, and she became aware of an observation that Parkinson's patients, the alpha-synuclein is nitrated at a much higher rate than background proteins. And so she said, wow, there must be an enzyme that specifically nitrates proteins or a subset of proteins. And everyone told her, oh, no. It's just biochemistry. The redox state of the cell either drives nitration or it doesn't, and that's it. And she said, well, hold it, but why alpha-synuclein? They said, oh, it must be Lewy bodies. It must be something about the Lewy bodies.
Experts.
Yeah. So she said, no, I kind of believe there's an enzyme. 15 years she harbored that hypothesis. She couldn't get anyone to fund her. This is Irene Griswold-Prenner. And she applied for an AbbVie Golden Ticket. She was able to win. She won an AbbVie Golden Ticket. She used that endorsement to go back. She was living in Montana at the time. She used that endorsement to get some wealthy Montana angel investors to give her a little money. She moved into our lab. And what do you know, but 18 months later, she had found not just a specific enzyme that drives the nitration of alpha-synuclein, but an entire class of enzymes, all of whom were listed as proteins of unknown function. Now, here we are in 2020 or 2019 when she made that discovery, and you think, how likely is it that we are going to find an entire class of post-translational modifying enzymes that we had never come across before? And are we likely to do that on 2 benches in an incubator in San Francisco? And both of those, the likely answer is no, you're not going to find new class of enzymes, and no, it's not going to happen in that sort of a resource. It's going to happen in some huge academic or pharmaceutical research enterprise. And didn't she do it? She was like a little David with a sling and a small stone taking on this Goliath of a biologic problem and industry problem. She's now raised $35 million. They're busily building drugs for lots of these enzymes. They haven't told anybody about these enzyme class yet. Will be coming out when the patent's published in the not too distant future. But just a fabulous, fabulous story. And so one of the things is I remain humble. To answer your original question, I remain humble about our knowledge of biology. So when CRISPR-Cas9 emerged on the scene, or RNAi, or nitration as a regulated post-translational process, I think most people thought, well, we know the architecture of the house. We've got enough biology knowledge. We've got a few panels we haven't figured out, but we got it. And then all of a sudden someone says, well, have you looked over there? There's a whole wing to the house you haven't even ever looked at. So we remain humble about our knowledge of biology. I'll bet you my bottom dollar 5 years from now, there'll be some unbelievable paper that shows that there's a wing over on the other side of the house we never thought about.
I truly believe that we don't know completely about a human body. So much of it is unknown yet.
Yes, exactly.
And a lot of people behave as if like they know it all, they know it right. And people like Irene is like, we need to encourage those things. And speaking of encouraging such entrepreneurs, being permissive to explore such ideas, what is lacking in the current funding models to support such entrepreneurs? Where does the funding need to evolve into?
Everyone wants the NIH to fund different work, right? David Schaefer, who you know very well, was a huge advocate for gene therapy from, 1990 onwards, and really a lone wolf. So far as I know, really, he was the only one on the Berkeley campus working on gene therapy, and really almost no one at UCSF, almost no dollars going. And he made the great observation, which is, I'm talking about curing disease. I'm not talking about palliative care. I'm talking about curing the disease forever. And so part of me would love to see the NIH do two things. One is to be more adventurous, to move the dollars to areas that would have the highest impact and the least apparent commercial relevance of gene therapy and like vaccines. Very few academics in UCSF and Berkeley up till COVID-19 could get $1 to work on vaccines. The best bang for the buck in terms of a therapeutic is never to get sick at all. Part of me would like to see more of that sort of research. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I would love to see the commercial realities inform academic research as well. So in other words, what are the unmet medical needs? I don't mean commercial reality. I would say clinical realities. You should interview Don Gannon, if you haven't already. He came and gave this blistering talk at UCSF once where he said, if you walk through a hospital and you ask what are patients sick and dying of, and then you look at what our academic labs are researching, there's not much overlap. There's a total disconnect. So I'd love to see at the other end the clinical need and commercial needs better inform some work. Okay, so that's at the NIH level. At the commercial level, breakthroughs, we really need to improve clinical trials. We, other CROs, have made preclinical research way more productive and efficient. Clinical trials remain wildly expensive. I'm not saying make them promiscuous, but if we could have innovation on that front, it would be really cool. Maybe that will come in the way of better integration of medical records, and we can find patients more easily. I don't know what it is. It's not my area, but I know that that would be a great area to innovate, and we should be thinking about that more. And then in terms of where venture capitalists put their dollars, that's been a rapidly evolving and educational. 20 years ago, there was a big push for NRDOs, no research development, only companies. I want a single asset that's close to the clinic. I'll take it in the clinic. Now it's only platforms. Public markets have been very open for 10 years or more. Is that going to continue? Yeah, but I'm happy that we are innovating on that front. So firms like Third Rock and the Column Group and others really champion this notion of build from scratch, flagship, and putting a ton of money to work in startups. And it's been very interesting what they've done. Arch and others have been trying their hand at these mega investments. You saw the $500 million company they created. Yeah. And so I think there's a good bit of innovation occurring in venture. I'm not sure what more. And then the last thing, if you'll let me, is we've built these great relationships with pharmaceutical companies, but I think we still need to improve the way in which mergers and acquisitions occur to make it a smoother pipeline between early stage companies and acquisitions. And that has to do in part with the difficulties they face in incorporating ideas and teams into their companies, the challenges that business development officers face when contemplating a $100 million deal rather than a $3 billion deal. And then it's on us to make those companies more ready and palatable to those acquisitions.
There's so much room to grow and learn and expand. I'm optimistic about human ingenuity. I think we will continue to thrive. Just stay on the subject of investors. What makes for great investors? I'm sure you work with other investors.
I wish I knew. No, I would say, first of all, there's a certain amount of eternal optimism you need to bring to the table. So you need to start with an open heart and open mind. There's plenty of time to be critical later, but start very optimistically. Not to be hidebound, not to be ruled by the past. The past is not necessarily a very good predictor of the future. I think there's a really good set of books in thinking about this. Super Forecasters is a good one. Noise is another one. Kahneman's book, that take into account how do we make decisions that allow us to be creative and avoid prejudices. Pattern matching.
I'll help you with something else I have in mind in terms of you're an entrepreneur. When you raise money as a biotech entrepreneur, what should they be looking for in an investor? There's so many of them, all colors, sizes, and shapes. We entrepreneurs just go and we'll tell our story to anybody who's willing to listen. Should there be a selective criteria to just make that experience a little more enjoyable and pleasant?
Well, first of all, there's the old saw, if you want to raise money, ask for advice. If you want advice, ask for money. Yeah. And so I think it's really great for entrepreneurs to seek advice. I told you the story for us, which is we sought advice and then we ignored it, but we were improved by it. We saw landmines that helped inform us. For instance, the idea of a long-term intensive care unit was where we got the 2-year ceiling from. And so our leases all say you have to leave within 2 years and that sort of thing. But I often see entrepreneurs with a deck and a story, and if it's not right for us, and then I sometimes have the occasion to see them 2 years later, a year later, after a long struggle, and the story bears no resemblance to the one that had before. It's been evolving so slowly, they may not even see that evolution. And now it's really a beautiful story, a well-conceived story. So I think it really pays to get out and talk to people a lot, but I would do it as much as possible on the advice side. Orchestrating the right time and place to go out and do the formal raise is an art form. And some people try to stage that to create a little competition and to create an auction environment. It doesn't very often work that well. I think the really experienced entrepreneurs are constantly looking for money and constantly talking to people. Who should they take money from? That can be an issue. So bad board dynamics can really be painful to companies. So I think some amount of simpatico collegiality is really going to be critical. You're going to be married to these people for 18 months, 2 years, maybe many more years. So having a good working relationship is important. The price is important, but maybe not as important as people think it is. There are going to be people who could be super helpful, super smart, really great to work with if they offered you a pre-money valuation that was lower than the rapacious, archetypal, evil venture capitalist. In the fullness of time, you may be happy you made that choice to the lower pre. Hard to know. It is a marriage.
It is a marriage. It also takes a village. So many people are going to be helping you. And it's about that networking that people need to do. Doug, you've been very, very patient with me and spent a lot of time. Let's close this on a note of what is the advice you give for entrepreneurs trying to approach you, either for MBC Biolabs or for Capital? Any words of wisdom and any plugins to how to contact you?
Just do it. Really, just do it. My wife just co-founded a company. It took me 10 years to convince her. She kept saying, well, one of us needs a real job. I said, I think I have a real job. She said, so she finally did it, and she's so much more energized by it. Rarely do we ever see a third of our entrepreneurs come from big companies, a third come from academic environments, and a third are serial entrepreneurs. The two that come from academia or big companies, you would think some of them would go, oh, this water's too cold. I want to go back into wherever I was before. Almost never happens. The people come, they love it, they love the agency, and so really just do it. You will not regret it. Come see me.
I completely agree with you. Yes. See Doug Crawford.
Yeah.
And I completely agree with, once you're in here, there's no way you're going to go back to any other parts of the world. Hey, it's been a gift talking to you.
Oh, my pleasure.
We'll be back with you soon with more topics, but thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Naresh. It's really been my pleasure. Bye-bye now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.